Good evening, economic students. Tonight we're launching into chapter 14. That is dealing with issues of poverty and wealth inequality. So these are topics that are much discussed. The upcoming presidential election, no doubt these will be issues on the table. So you need to understand the economic issues involved, some of the kind of things that people will be talking about, because this is very much a part of American political life as well as economics. And we've touched on a few of these issues a little bit in class when we still were able to meet in person together. So please turn in your textbooks. You really want your textbook in front of you. There's going to be graphs that you just got to see. Looking at chapter 14. So I'm going to read aloud one paragraph near the beginning. Labor markets, this is on page 308 in the second edition of me. It's just above 14.1. Labor markets do create considerable inequalities of income. In 2014, the median American family income was $57,939. The median is the level where half of all families had more than that level and half had less. Remember, a median, if you listed everybody, where would half be above and half be below the midpoint? So you have to list every individual, the 330 million of us, well, be households, so probably more like 110, 120 million or something. Where would the median be? The middle would be $57,939 in 2014, 5 years ago. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, almost 9 million U.S. families were classified by the federal government as being below the poverty line in that year. And we'll talk about poverty line in a minute. Think about a family of three, perhaps a single mother with two dependent children, attempting to pay for the basics of life on perhaps $17,916 per year. After paying rent, health care, clothing, and transportation, such a family might have $6,000 to spend on food. So three people, $6,000 spent on food in the course of a year. Spread over 365 days, the food budget for the entire family would be about $17 per day. To put this in perspective, most cities have restaurants where $17 would buy you an appetizer for one. And, heck, there are lots of restaurants where an entree would run you $17. So this is not an exorbitant amount for a family of three to spend on food every day, $17. And I think we did talk about like rent. Just price the rent here in Bedford. Just get on the phone with someone and call up an apartment complex. And you'd want, if you want to live a decent life, you got two kids and a mom, you're going to want to have 2 bedrooms and some kind of living room, right? So 2-bedroom apartment. I'd be stunned if you could get a decent 2-bedroom apartment in Bedford for less than $1,500 a month. And that probably means you're still paying your light bill. And of course you got your phone bill and all that too. So this family with $19,700 to spend a year, what's 1,500 times 12? Well, it's pushing 19,000, right? So right there, the rent alone would probably eat it up to live in Bedford. So you're going to have to live in a dreadful place on that kind of budget if you're going to still have $6,000 left for food. Anyway, that just puts in perspective the question of poverty. If you're in that kind of income range, what are you going to be doing in America? All right. So the key terms here. Poverty is, as it's defined in section 14.1, poverty is measured by the number of people who fall below a certain level of income, called the poverty line, that defines the income needed for a basic standard of living. So the poverty line is set by the government when they're collecting statistics. And we'll talk about how that was originally created in America, and it's been modified a little, but not much, as to what the poverty line is. Income inequality, that's another term that will be used in this, compares the share of total income or wealth in a society that is received by different groups. For example, comparing the share of income received by the top 10% to the share of income received by the bottom 10%. So we'll talk more about that, but we'll just focus on the first question, the poverty line. And it's pointed out there that Molly Oshansky in 1963 is the one who came up with the first material on the poverty line. She was doing a study for the Social Security Administration on the children of the poor. And so she was looking at the simple question of food. What does it cost in America at this time to have a basic, healthy, nutritional meal daily? 3 times a day. To eat nutritionally soundly, how much does it cost? And taking that, and she assumed, based on the stats then, which apparently are what they still pretty much use now, that the average American family spends 1/3 of its income on food. So, that's probably why they said $19,000 in income, about $6,000 on food for the poor family in the first paragraph I just read to you, about 1/3 on food. So if you know how much a nutritional meal 3 times a day would cost for your household, magnify that by 3 times, multiply that by 3 times, that's going to give you the poverty line, below which, if you don't have that, you're in some danger of not getting nutritious food. That raises other questions about, can you afford the rent to live in an apartment, and what is your life going to be like in other ways? But the basic things started out being calculated by food in the budget. So the current U.S. poverty line is essentially the same as the Olshansky poverty line, although the dollar amounts are adjusted each year to represent the same buying power over time. The poverty line in 2015, so 5 years ago, ranged from $11,790 for a single individual. And note that. That is only a bit more than $11,000 a year for a single person. That's about less than $950 a month for an individual, or $25,240 for a household of 4. Okay. So that's the poverty line. So how many Americans fall below that line? Well, on average, since the 1960s, it's averaged about 11%. So about 1 in 9 Americans over the last 50 years has fallen below the poverty line. So when you hear about the poor, statistically, that's what we're talking about. 1 in 9 Americans fall in that group. But if you look at your chart on page 309, it's figure 14.2, you can see the percentage of Americans living below the poverty line. When they first created it, it was about 18%. But then you see a precipitous decline in the 1960s. Now, part of that is because of the Great Society welfare programs that came in. And we'll talk about some of those, food stamps and other forms of aid to the poor from the federal government meant that they got a boost in income and a boost in buying power for food and the like, and that greatly reduced the poverty rate from around 18% to around 8% in 1970. So all these programs to assist the poor really did, cut things about in half, the percentage of Americans below the poverty line. And then you can see as you go there, there was a recession in the early 80s, and there was another recession in the early 1990s, and those kicked up the poverty percentage of people living in poverty again. And then you see, bang, the Great Recession of 2008 and its aftermath, peaking in 2010. In the years since this line ends, clearly it went down. Now, the present, you've probably seen the figures on unemployment going skyrocketing just last week, but, well, that'll all have to be sorted out, how they're going to keep track of these sudden COVID-19 job losses and all that. But generally, the last 5 years, the economy has been improving, and it was doing great until just about a month ago. So I imagine the poverty line had dropped at least back below 10% again. I'm not sure the exact figure. Anyway, on the bottom of 309, table 14.1 does point out that the poverty rate does vary considerably by both gender and racial and ethnic group. You can see there that more females, 15.8, compared to males, 13.1 in 2013. Now that's after the Great Recession, so it's higher than it would have been until very recently. But why would females have more percentage living in poverty? These are probably women who don't have spouses, who are probably trying to raise children. You can imagine the scenario there, that they're going to be hard pressed to make as much money if they've got kids to look after and no spousal support and the like, or inadequate spousal support. So anyway, the rate of poverty for females is higher. And then, as you can see, it is greatly varied by race or ethnicity. 9.6% of white Americans are below the poverty line in 2013, 27.1. It's nearly 3 times the percentage of black Americans, 23.5% of Hispanic Americans. So I don't imagine that's a shock to anybody, but there you see it. Now, what might be a little surprising is who the poor are on the basis of age. Looking at table 14.1, young adults and children are the poorest Americans by percentage of the population. The elderly are actually doing the best of anybody. Now, part of that is because they may have saved well over a long time of life of earning money and hopefully built up retirement, but there's also Social Security. You're going to get, I think, at least $1,200 if you're fully vested in the Social Security program a month. And that goes a ways towards keeping you out of poverty. Although you probably need a little extra supplement there if you're going to live comfortably above the poverty line. But the Social Security helps that a good deal. But most people are probably at the peak of their earning capacity in their 50s and 60s. So you can see there it's 10.7%. So that's about as low as it's going to be. But kids and young adults, those are the ones who have the highest percentage of poverty. Interesting question. How do you measure poverty in the poorest countries of the world where everybody is poor? America is a prosperous country, so we can look and say, 10% roughly of Americans are poor. Well, what if you live in a place like Haiti or Burkina Faso in Africa? These places have a wretched history of extreme poverty for lots of their citizens. The World Bank, so I'm reading under Clear It Up on 310. The World Bank sets 2 poverty lines for low-income countries around the world. One poverty line is set at an income of $1.25 per day per person. That's $1.25 a day per person. The other is at $2 per day. So the very poorest countries and the slightly less desperately poor countries. By comparison, the U.S. poverty line of $20,090 annually for a family of 3 works out to $18.35 per person per day. So that's 15 times higher or something than what they're talking about in these very poorest countries. Clearly, many people around the world are far poorer than Americans. China and India both have more than 1 billion people. Nigeria is the most populous country in Africa, and Egypt is the most populous country in the Middle East. In all 4 of those countries, in the mid-2000s, a substantial share of the population subsisted on less than $2 per day. Indeed, about half the world lives on less than $2.50 per day, and 80% of the world lives on less than $10 per day. Of course, the cost of food and shelter in those countries can be very different from the United States. So that's worth keeping in mind. I mean, you live in New York City, just buying a loaf of bread is going to take up a pretty decent chunk of that change. But you probably can buy a loaf of bread for $2.50 in New York City. So obviously there are cost of living issues to take into account. But still, you can see in your book in chart table 14.2 the poverty line in those poor countries. Very high percentage. India, 68.8% of the population living on less than $2 per day in India. Less than $2 per day. Almost 70% of the people in the country. All right, we're going to have to stop this lecture there. We'll take up the poverty trap, what the poverty trap is, in the next lecture and move on from there. God bless.